David had been sitting in the same corner of downtown coffee for 3 months straight. Every Tuesday and Thursday, to PM sharp, he would grab his usual table by the window and open his laptop. The work was boring, editing promotional videos for a local insurance company, but the routine gave him comfort, order, predictability. He liked predictable things. His morning coffee was always black, no sugar. His lunch was always the same turkey sandwich from the deli downstairs. His life moved in straight lines, and he was okay with that. At 28, David had convinced himself that excitement was overrated. The rain was doing its usual Seattle thing that Thursday afternoon, creating streams down the coffee shop windows. David was halfway through editing a particularly dull video about car insurance when the door chimed. He didn't look up. People came and went all day, but something felt different this time. The energy in the room shifted. Conversations got quieter. Even the barista seemed to move slower behind the counter. David finally glanced up from his screen and saw why. She stood near the entrance, shaking raindrops from her dark hair. She wasn't tall, maybe 5'5", but she carried herself like she owned the entire city. Her clothes were simple, dark jeans and a paint-stained sweater. But there was something magnetic about the way she moved. She scanned the coffee shop with eyes that seemed to see everything at once. David tried to go back to his work, but his fingers had stopped typing. He found himself watching her from the corner of his eye as she approached the counter. She ordered something in Spanish to the confused barista, then laughed and switched to English. Her laugh was rich and genuine, the kind that made other people smile without knowing why. The coffee shop was only half full, with plenty of empty tables scattered around. David's table was tucked away in the corner, surrounded by 3 empty chairs. He had chosen it specifically because people rarely bothered him there. It was his space, his routine, his comfort zone. So when she walked directly toward his table, David felt his heart rate pick up. She moved with purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the rest of the coffee shop seemed to fade away. "You're in my seat," she said. Standing beside his table, David looked around at all the empty chairs. "I don't think this table is reserved for anyone," she smiled. And it was the kind of smile that suggested she knew secrets that no one else did. "It is now." Before David could ask what she meant, she leaned down and kissed him. Not a gentle, questioning kiss, but something bold and confident. Her lips were warm against his, tasting faintly of cinnamon and rain. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like the world had stopped spinning. When she pulled away, David sat there stunned. His laptop screen had gone dark. His coffee had gone cold. Nothing in his 28 years had prepared him for this moment. What just happened? He whispered. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down like they had been meeting. "Here for yours. I claimed your mouth," she said simply. "Now this is your seat too." David's mind was racing. This wasn't how things worked in his world. People didn't just walk up to strangers and kiss them. There were rules, procedures, a proper way to do things. Yet here she was, treating the most shocking moment of his life like it was perfectly normal. "I don't even know your name," he said. "Isabella," she replied. "And you're David. You work for Morrison Insurance. You edit their videos. You always sit in this corner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You drink your coffee black, and you haven't taken a real vacation in 2 years." David felt his mouth fall open. "How do you know all that?" Isabella's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I'm observant. I've been watching you for weeks." "Watching me? Why?" "Because you looked lonely, and because you have kind eyes, and because I was curious about what would happen if someone shook up your very organized little world." David didn't know whether to be flattered or terrified. "So you just decided to kiss me?" "I decided to wake you up," Isabella said. "Tell me, when was the last time something unexpected happened in your life?" David thought about it. Really thought about it. His days were scheduled down to the minute. His weekends followed the same pattern. Even his grocery shopping was planned in advance. "I can't remember," he admitted. "That's what I thought." Isabella leaned back in her chair, studying him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "You're sleepwalking through life, David. When did you stop taking risks?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He thought about his childhood, when he used to climb trees and explore the woods behind his house. He thought about college, when he had dreamed of making documentaries that would change the world. Somewhere along the way, he had chosen safety over adventure, routine over surprise. "I don't know," he said quietly. Isabella reached across the table and closed his laptop. "Well, I'm about to remind you what it feels like to be alive." David should have been angry. She had no right to interrupt his work, to invade his space, to turn his afternoon upside down. But instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced. In years, excitement. His heart was beating faster, his palms were sweating, and for the first time in months, he felt completely present in the moment. "What do you do?" he asked. "I'm an artist. I paint things that make people feel something." She gestured toward the window, where the rain was still falling. "I have a studio a few blocks from here. Would you like to see it?" David looked at his laptop, then at his watch. He had 3 more videos to edit before 5 o'clock. His schedule was already planned out for the rest of the day. The responsible thing would be to politely decline and get back to work instead. He heard himself saying, "Yes." Isabella's smile was radiant. "Good. That's the first step." "First step to what?" She stood up and waited for him to pack his things. "To remembering who you used to be before you decided to play it safe." As David closed his laptop and followed Isabella toward the door, he felt like he was crossing an invisible line. Behind him was his ordered, predictable life. Ahead was something unknown and potentially dangerous, for the first time in years. Dangerous felt appealing. The rain had stopped by the time they stepped outside, leaving the streets shining and clean. Isabella walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing against his arm. David realized he was holding his breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Are you nervous?" Isabella asked, terrified. David admitted. "Good," she said. "Fear means you're paying attention." As they walked down the wet sidewalk toward whatever came next, David couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't control. The kiss had been just the beginning. Isabella had claimed his mouth in that coffee shop. But somehow he knew she wasn't finished with him yet, and for the first time in years, he didn't want her to be. 3 weeks had passed since that first kiss, and David's life had become completely unrecognizable. His alarm clock still rang at 7 in the morning, but now instead of reaching for his phone to check emails, he would find himself staring at the ceiling, wondering when Isabella would call. She never followed patterns. Sometimes she would text him at 6 in the morning with messages like "Meet me at the pier," "Bring coffee." Other times, she would show up at his apartment at midnight with paint on her hands and stories. That made his small world feel enormous. David had started keeping a change of clothes in his car because Isabella's invitations were always urgent and never planned. His coworkers at Morrison Insurance had begun to notice his frequent absences from afternoon meetings. His supervisor, Mr. Peterson, had already asked him twice if everything was okay at home. Everything was more than okay. Everything was electric. Isabella's art studio was a converted warehouse in the industrial district, filled with canvases that seemed to breathe with life. The first time she brought him there, David had stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the explosion of color and emotion covering every surface. Paintings of dancers mid-leap, storms over oceans, faces twisted in joy and pain. It was like stepping into someone else's dreams. "This is what I see when I close my eyes," Isabella had told him, gesturing at a painting of a woman running through a field of sunflowers. "Most people see the world in black and white. I see it in every color that exists." David had grown up in a house where art meant the landscape painting above the fireplace that his mother had bought at a furniture store. Watching Isabella paint was like discovering a new language. She moved around the canvas like she was dancing, her whole body involved in creating each brushstroke. "Talk to me while I work," she would say. And David would find himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, about his childhood fear of deep water, about his father, who had died when David was 15 and left him feeling like he had to be responsible for everyone, about his secret dream of traveling to places where nobody knew his name. Isabella listened while she painted, asking questions that made David think about his life in ways he never had before. "Why did you choose insurance videos?" she asked one evening, adding purple shadows to a painting of city lights reflected in rain puddles. "It pays well," David had answered automatically. "That's not what I asked." Isabella paused, looking at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see through everything. "I asked why you chose it." David realized he hadn't chosen it at all. He had just fallen into it after college, taking the first job that offered security and benefits. One day had led to another, and before he knew it, 3 years had passed. "I don't know," he admitted. "When did you stop dreaming?" Isabella asked, the same way someone might ask about the weather. The question followed David home that night. He lay in bed thinking about the 15-year-old version of himself who had wanted to make films that would inspire people. That kid had been fearless, full of ideas that seemed to pour out of him like water from a broken dam. What had happened to that person? Isabella was changing him in ways he couldn't control. His apartment, which had always been organized and minimal, was now scattered with books she had lent him, books about art, about travel, about people who had chosen adventure over safety. His refrigerator was covered with sketches she had made of him. When he wasn't looking, David laughing, David thinking, David sleeping on her studio couch after a long day of watching her work. His best friend Jake had started to worry. "Dude, you're different," Jake had said over beers the previous weekend. "You missed poker night 3 times this month. You barely answer your phone anymore. What's going on with this girl?" David had tried to explain. But how could he describe the way Isabella made him feel? How could he tell Jake that for the first time in years, he felt like he was actually living instead of just existing? "She's just intense," David had said, which was like describing the ocean as wet. Intense can be dangerous. Jake had warned, "Don't lose yourself in someone else's world." But David was beginning to wonder if he had been lost long before Isabella found him. The person he had been, responsible, predictable, safe, was that really who he was? Or was it just who he had decided to become because it was easier then? Taking risks, Isabella never asked him to change. She just saw parts of him that he had forgotten existed, and reflected them back to him like a mirror. When she laughed at his jokes, David realized he was actually funny. When she asked his opinion about her paintings, he discovered he had thoughts about art that he didn't know he possessed. "You have good instincts," she told him one afternoon as they stood in front of a canvas she had been working on for weeks. It was a painting of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out at an endless sky. "You just don't trust them?" David studied the painting. The man in it looked familiar, though he couldn't place why. "How do you know when a painting is finished?" "When it tells me something I didn't know before I started." Isabella wiped her hands on a rag already stained with every color imaginable. "This one's been telling me about courage, about what happens when you stop being afraid of falling." That night, David went home and looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at him was the same one he had seen every morning for 28 years, but something behind the eyes was different. There was a brightness there, a sense of possibility that had been missing for so long he had forgotten. It was supposed to be there. His phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Tomorrow I want to show you something that will change how you see the world." David smiled, realizing that she had been showing him things that changed how he saw the world every day. For 3 weeks, the difference was that now he was ready to see them. He looked at his carefully organized closet, his color-coordinated work clothes, his life planned out in neat little boxes. Then he thought about Isabella's studio, chaotic and beautiful and alive with possibility, for the first time since he was 15 years old. David fell asleep excited about tomorrow. David woke up to the sound of his phone ringing at 4 in the morning. Isabella's name flashed on the screen, and he answered without hesitation. 3 weeks ago. A call at this hour would have sent him into a panic. Now, it just meant Isabella needed him. "I have to go home." Her voice was shaky, different from her usual confident tone. My grandmother is dying. I need to fly to Barcelona today. David sat up in bed, fully awake now. I'm coming with you. David, you don't understand. This isn't a vacation. This is family, and it's complicated. And I don't know how long I'll be gone. I don't care, he said, already getting out of bed. You shouldn't go through this alone. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Then, quietly, okay? 6 hours later, they were on a plane to Spain. Isabella stared out the window during most of the flight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. David had never seen her so still, so quiet. The woman who painted storms and danced around her studio was now sitting like a statue, lost in thoughts she wasn't sharing. Tell me about your grandmother, David said softly, Isabella's. Eyes stayed fixed on the clouds below. Her name is Carmen. She raised me after my parents couldn't handle the responsibility. She taught me everything I know about art, about life, about being brave enough to take what you want. She sounds amazing. She is. But she's also the only family I have left who actually knows me. Isabella turned to look at David for the first time since they boarded the plane. My mother drinks too much wine and pretends her life is perfect. My father sends birthday cards from whatever country he's living in this year. But Carmen, she sees me, really sees me. David reached over and took her hand. It was cold and trembling. She's going to be okay. No, she's not. Isabella's voice cracked. The doctors called yesterday. She asked for me specifically. She wants to say goodbye. The old woman lying in the bed surrounded by candles and flowers was tiny. But David could immediately see where Isabella had gotten her strength, even sick. Carmen's eyes held the same intensity, the same fire that had drawn him to Isabella in that coffee shop. So you're the one, Carmen said in accented English, looking David up and down. The one who finally caught my granddaughter's attention. David wasn't sure how to respond. I'm David. I know who you are. Isabella has told me about you. The safe man who is learning to be dangerous. The sleeping man who is finally waking up. Carmen's smile was warm but knowing. She chooses carefully, my Isabella. But when she chooses, she gives everything. Over the next 3 days, David learned more about Isabella than he had in the previous month. He met her childhood friends, saw the small apartment where she had grown up, walked through the narrow streets where she had learned to see the world as her canvas. He also learned about her wounds. Her mother, Sophia, was a beautiful woman who spoke in sharp tones and drank wine with every meal. She criticized Isabella's clothes, her hair, her decision to live so far from home. Art is not a real job, she said in Spanish, not caring that David couldn't understand. When will you find a husband and settle down like a normal person? Isabella translated later, her jaw tight with frustration. She's been saying the same thing since I was 18. In her world, success means marriage and children and a nice house in the suburbs. She doesn't understand that I need to create things, that I need to feel alive. David began to understand why Isabella had kissed him that first day. She hadn't been trying to seduce him. She had been trying to wake him up because she knew what it felt like to be surrounded by people who were asleep. On the second night, Isabella's father called. David watched her face change as she listened to him make excuses about why he couldn't come home. Even now, when she hung up, she didn't say anything. She just walked out onto the small balcony and stood there, looking out at the city lights. David found her there an hour later, tears streaming down her face. He's not coming, she whispered. His own mother is dying, and he's not coming. I'm here, David said, pulling her into his arms. Why? Isabella looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. Why did you drop everything to come with me? You barely know me. David had been asking himself the same question 3 weeks ago. He wouldn't have missed work for his own grandmother's funeral. Now he was in a foreign country, holding a woman he had known for less than a month, feeling like this was exactly where he belonged. Because you matter to me, he said simply. That night, Carmen took a turn for the worse. Isabella sat by her bedside, holding her hand and speaking to her in rapid Spanish. David couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the love in them, the desperation. She wants to know if you make me happy, Isabella translated, wiping tears from her eyes. David looked at the old woman, then at Isabella. Tell her that. You make me feel alive. Carmen smiled and nodded, then spoke again in Spanish. Isabella laughed through her tears. She says that's the same thing. When Carmen died the next morning, Isabella fell apart completely. The strong, confident woman who had walked into his life and turned it upside down became someone small and broken. She cried against David's chest for hours, and he held her. Feeling something shift inside him that he couldn't name died at the funeral. Isabella's extended family filled the small church. Aunts and uncles and cousins David had never met embraced him like he belonged there. They spoke about Carmen's life, about her strength, about the way she had raised Isabella to be fearless. She always said that love was not something you ate for. One of Isabella's aunts told David, it's something you choose every day. She chose to love Isabella even when it was difficult. Isabella chose to love her art even when it was impractical. Now she has chosen to love you. That night, as they packed to return to Seattle, David realized that something fundamental had changed. He wasn't just infatuated with Isabella anymore. He wasn't just excited by her unpredictability or attracted to her confidence. He was in love with her, completely, terrifyingly, irreversibly in love, and for the first time in his life. That didn't scare him. It felt like coming home. 6 months after Barcelona, David's life had become something he wouldn't have recognized a year ago. He had quit his job at Morrison Insurance 2 weeks after they returned from Spain. The decision had terrified him, but watching Isabella grieve for her grandmother had made him realize how short life really was. I can't spend my days making videos about car insurance, he had told his supervisor, Mr. Peterson. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I need to do something that matters. Mr. Peterson had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. David, you have benefits here, a steady paycheck, a retirement plan. You're throwing away security for what? To chase some dream. But David had already made up his mind. He started freelancing, taking on projects that actually excited him. Documentary work for local nonprofits, wedding videos where he could capture real emotions, commercial projects for small businesses that were trying to make a difference in their communities. The money was less predictable, but for the first time in years, David looked forward to waking up in the morning. He had also moved. His old apartment, with its beige walls and carefully organized furniture, had started to feel like a prison. Isabella had helped him find a loft in the Arts District, just 6 blocks from her studio. The space was raw and unfinished, with exposed brick walls and concrete floors. But it felt alive in a way his old place never had. Isabella had been painting him obsessively since they returned from Barcelona. His face appeared on canvas after canvas, but these weren't just portraits. They were studies of transformation. David sleeping, but with an expression of peace he'd never seen on his own face. David laughing, captured in a moment of pure joy. David thinking, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked on a project he actually cared about. You're different. In each one, Isabella had explained one evening as they stood in her studio, surrounded by versions of himself. It's like watching someone become who they were always meant to be. David studied the paintings, amazed by what he saw. The man in these images looked confident, purposeful, fully alive. When had he started looking like that? Is this really how you see me? He asked. Isabella stepped closer, paint still fresh on her hands from the canvas she'd been working on all day. This is how you see yourself now. I'm just showing you what was always there. The centerpiece of her collection was a painting she called Soul Deep. It showed David from behind, standing in front of a massive window, looking out at a city that seemed to glow with possibility. His shoulders were relaxed, his posture confident. Everything about the image suggested someone who had found his place in the world. When did you paint this? David asked. Last week, while you were sleeping after that documentary shoot. Isabella smiled, the way she always did when she was pleased with her work. You came home exhausted but happy, really happy. I realized I'd never seen you look like that before. David thought about the documentary he'd been working on. about a local teacher who had started a program to help homeless students. It had been challenging work, technically demanding, but every moment had felt meaningful. He had stayed late, editing not because he had to, but because he wanted to get it right. "I love what I do now," he said, surprised by how true it felt. "I know." Isabella's voice was soft. "You're finally living your life instead of just surviving it." Their friends had started to notice the changes too. Jake, who had been worried about David's intense girlfriend, had grudgingly admitted that David seemed happier than he'd been in years. "I don't know what she did to you," Jake had said over coffee the previous weekend, "but you're like a different person. You actually have opinions now. You take risks. You seem, I don't know, more awake." David's mother had been less supportive. During their monthly phone call, she had expressed concern about his impulsive career change and his unconventional living situation. "I just worry that you're making decisions with your heart instead of your head," she had said. "What if this art thing doesn't work out? What if this girl breaks your heart?" David had tried to explain that Isabella hadn't changed him. She had just helped him remember who he really was. But his mother came from a generation that valued security above all else. She couldn't understand that sometimes the safest choice was actually the most dangerous one. The truth was, David had become completely dependent on Isabella's way of seeing the world. She had taught him to notice things he'd been blind to his entire life: the way morning light fell across his loft's brick walls, the stories hidden in strangers' faces, the difference between existing and truly living. But the dependency went both ways. Isabella had become equally absorbed in documenting his transformation. She painted him the way some people wrote in diaries, using his face to work through her own thoughts and feelings. "You're my favorite subject," she told him one night as she cleaned her brushes. "Other people I paint once or twice, but you're different every time I look at you." David realized that they had become something beyond just a couple. They were collaborators in each other's growth, witnesses to each other's becoming. Isabella had claimed his mouth with that first kiss, his heart through their deepening love. And now she was claiming his very identity by showing him who he could be. But it wasn't one-sided. David had claimed something in Isabella too, her vulnerability, which she had shown to very few people, her need to be seen and understood, not just admired. Her desire to create something lasting with someone who truly appreciated her vision. "Do you ever worry that we're disconnected?" David asked one evening as they sat on the floor of his loft, sharing takeout Chinese food surrounded by her latest paintings. Isabella considered the question seriously. "I used to worry that I was too much for people, too intense, too demanding, too complicated. But with you, I worry that I'm not enough." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've changed so much, grown so much. What if you outgrow me? What if you realize you don't need me anymore?" David looked at her, this woman who had literally walked into his life and turned it upside down. The idea of outgrowing Isabella was impossible. She wasn't just part of his life now. She was woven into the very fabric of who he was becoming. "That's not how this works," he said, pulling her closer. "We're not changing separately. We're changing together." That night, as they lay in bed surrounded by paintings of his transformation, David realized that he had crossed a point of no return. The old David, the one who had worked at Morrison Insurance and eaten the same lunch every day, was gone. In his place was someone braver, more creative, more alive. Isabella had claimed his soul, but in doing so, she had given him a new one, and he wouldn't trade it for all the security in the world. The invitation had arrived on expensive cream paper, delivered by hand to their loft. Isabella's first solo art exhibition was happening at the prestigious Meridian Gallery downtown. 3 months of preparation had led to this moment, and David had watched Isabella transform from excited to nervous to terrified and back again. "What if nobody comes?" she had asked the night before, pacing around their loft like a caged animal. "What if they come but hate everything? What if the paintings don't make sense to anyone but me?" David had pulled her into his arms, feeling the familiar weight of her fears. "Then we'll deal with it together." "But Isabella, your work is incredible. People are going to see what I see every day." "What do you see?" I see someone who paints the truth. Someone who shows people parts of themselves they didn't know existed. The gallery was packed by 7 o'clock. Seattle's art community had turned out in force, along with collectors, critics, and curious strangers drawn by the buzz surrounding Isabella's work. David stood near the entrance, watching people discover her paintings for the first time, seeing their faces change as they really looked at what she had created. The exhibition was called Becoming, and it told the story of transformation through a series of portraits, not just of David, though he appeared in many of them, but of various people Isabella had painted over the past 2 years. Each painting captured someone in a moment of change, of growth, of becoming more themselves. But the centerpiece of the show was a series of 12 paintings that traced David's journey. From that first day in the coffee shop to now, the progression was subtle but unmistakable. In the early paintings, his face was closed off, guarded. His eyes looked past the viewer, as if he was somewhere else entirely. But as the series progressed, something opened up. His expression became more present, more alive, more connected to the world around him. The final painting in the series was called Soul Claimed. It showed David not as he appeared to the world, but as Isabella saw him. His face was peaceful but alert, his eyes full of purpose and possibility. He looked like someone who had found his place in the world, someone who was exactly where he belonged. Is that really how I look now? David asked Isabella as they stood in front of the painting together. That's how you've always looked to me, she replied. I just had to show you how to see it. People moved through the gallery in small groups, stopping to study individual paintings, talking in the hushed tones that art often inspired. David overheard fragments of conversations as he walked through the crowd. The technique is masterful, but it's the emotional depth that really gets you. You can see the artist's connection to her subjects. This isn't just observation, it's love. Look at the progression in this series. It's like watching someone wake up. An older woman approached David near the middle of the exhibition. She was elegantly dressed, with silver hair and intelligent eyes. Excuse me, but you're the subject of these paintings, aren't you? David nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed. Some of them, yes. I'm Margaret Chen from the Times. I'm reviewing the show for tomorrow's paper. She gestured toward the series of paintings that featured him. I have to ask, what was it like to be seen so completely by someone else? David considered the question. A year ago, he would have been terrified by the idea of being seen so thoroughly. His old life had been built on keeping himself hidden, on staying safe behind walls of routine and predictability. It was terrifying at first, he admitted. But then it became the most liberating thing that ever happened to me. When someone sees you that clearly and still chooses to love you, it changes everything. Margaret smiled and made a note in her notebook. And the artist? What did she see in you that others missed? David looked across the gallery to where Isabella was talking to a group of potential buyers. She was animated, passionate, explaining the story behind one of her paintings with the same intensity. She brought to everything in her life she saw who I could become, he said, and then she helped me become that person. As the evening progressed, red dots began appearing next to paintings on the wall, indicating sales. David watched Isabella's face light up each time someone purchased one of her works. This wasn't just about money, though the sales meant she could continue creating. It was about connection, about her vision reaching people and making them feel something. Near the end of the evening, a young couple approached the soul-claimed painting. The woman pointed to David's painted face and said to her partner, "That's exactly how you look when you're really happy, like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." The man studied the painting for a long moment. "I want to feel like that," he said quietly. "I want to look like that." David felt a chill run down his spine. A year ago, he had been that man, looking at other people's happiness from the outside, wondering what it felt like to be truly alive. Now he was the person others looked at and envied. Isabella appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. "How do you feel about being famous?" she asked with a smile. "I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself," David replied. "These paintings aren't just about me. They're about what's possible when someone believes in you." As the crowd began to thin, David and Isabella found themselves alone in front of the final painting in the series. The gallery lights had been dimmed, creating an intimate atmosphere that made the artwork seem to glow from within. "Do you regret it?" Isabella asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Being claimed. Having your life turned upside down, losing your safe, predictable world." David thought about the question seriously. He thought about his old apartment, his old job, his old life of careful routines and minimal risks. He thought about the man he had been a year ago, sitting in that coffee shop, editing insurance videos and wondering if this was all there was. "I regret that it took so long for you to find me," he said finally. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," David replied. "But more than that, I love who I am when I'm with you. I love the life we've built together. I love that you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Seattle, David realized that Isabella had succeeded in claiming all of him, his mouth with that first bold kiss, his heart through their deepening love and shared experiences, his soul by showing him who he really was and who he could become. But the claiming had been mutual. In opening himself up to Isabella's vision, David had also claimed her talent, her passion, her need to be understood and appreciated, her vulnerability, which she shared with so few people, her dreams of creating something beautiful and lasting in the world. They had claimed each other completely, and in doing so, they had both found something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Not just love, but the courage to become their truest selves, standing in their loft later that night, surrounded by the paintings that told their story. David understood that being claimed wasn't about losing yourself. It was about finding yourself in someone else's eyes and discovering that you were more beautiful, more capable, more alive than you had ever imagined. Isabella had claimed his mouth, his heart, and his soul, and in return, he had given her the same. It was the most beautiful surrender either of them had ever experienced.